Thanks, Sue. All right. Okay. There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third session in our webinar series on interdisciplinary teaching and learning. Today's speakers are Dr. Blane Harvey and Emily Sprowls from McGill University. Dr. Harvey, you can wave, is an associate professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education, where he leads the Leadership and Learning for Sustainability Lab. He is an interdisciplinary researcher whose work spans the social and natural sciences on the themes of learning, collaboration, environmental change, and education for sustainable development. Emily Sprowls is a faculty lecturer and doctoral candidate at McGill with a master in environmental science from Yale University. Her work aims to collaborate with youth, scientists, and teachers to address students' questions about science and the environment. She has experience teaching K-12 and has also been an environmental educator in alternative, informal, and international settings. Today, Blane and Emily will help us better understand how and why we can engage in interdisciplinary teaching and learning. For some context, in November, our colleagues from UBC and Concordia shared with us successful examples of interdisciplinary programs and courses at their institutions. They also shared with us the theory behind what we mean when we say interdisciplinary. Notably, Dr. James Charbonneau walked us through the continuum of disciplinary integration that you see on the slide, running from the multidisciplinary approach of bringing different perspectives to bear on the same problem, all the way to the transdisciplinary approach of integrating multiple perspectives and methods so fully that a new way of thinking emerges. So over the last year in the webinar series, we've had examples of interdisciplinary teaching and learning that at all of these levels, except the last. Transdisciplinary work doesn't just cross or blur the boundaries, it transcends them. With its real-world focus, transdisciplinary work almost always requires involving stakeholders beyond the academia, which is something we're going to see today. While exciting and inspiring, it's hard to imagine what this looks like in the classroom. So today's speakers, Dr. Blane Harvey and Emily Sprowls, will share their experience engaging in transdisciplinary course design. With their significant experience not only designing their own course, but working with many different colleagues to help them design and redesign their courses with a focus on sustainability, Emily and Blane have a lot to share with us about the challenges, supports, and possibilities of transdisciplinary teaching and learning. So I'm about to hand you over to them, but just to take care of a little bit of business, if you have a question today while our speakers are talking, you can raise your hand, or perhaps better yet, for the first part, just type your questions in the chat and we'll answer them as we can. And if they don't get addressed, I'll keep track of them and make sure we come back to them during the Q&A. There will be a lot, as I'll tell you, there'll be a lot more chances to ask questions as time goes on, but you can ask your questions during the talk itself, that's fine. And also, when you leave the webinar, we ask that you just complete a 2-minute survey, as we always do. Sue's going to post it in the chat so that we can continue to offer events that suit your interests. All right, thanks, Sue. And Emily and Blane, it is over to you now. Oh, I didn't stop my screen share so you can see. That wasn't well done. That's okay. There you go. I'll stop it now.
Thanks very much, and just take a moment to get myself set up here. Can I confirm that you can see us, everything's showing up as it should? Great. Well, thanks so much, and thank you everyone for joining. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you as an audience, to a diverse set of interested collaborators, educators, and scholars. As mentioned, I'm Blane Harvey, and here with Emily Sprowls. We'll tell you a little bit more about ourselves in just a moment. I also want to sort of recognize that we are joining you today from Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, which is on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and a traditional meeting point for for many nations, and this kind of notion of convergence and co-creation and kind of negotiation of meaning and kind of reconciliation, I think, are really at the core of transformative sustainability learning, transformative pedagogies, and some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So probably worth bearing these things in mind as we navigate the conversation we're going to have today. So as mentioned, I think our focus in our conversation today is going to be sharing with you some of our experiences with transdisciplinary course design at McGill University, and in particular in our partnerships in teaching and learning about sustainability. In particular, when we talk about sustainability, we're thinking here about kind of environmental and sustainability education, in relation to the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and many other intersecting social, ecological, and economic crises that we currently confront. But maybe before we jump into that, we'll just break the ice and invite you to share a reflection into the chat. If you could just take a moment and put into the chat one learning experience that you've been part of that got you out of your comfort zone, maybe out of your classroom, if you're thinking about it as an educator. So if you could just take a minute and just in a sentence or two, reflect on that. We'll give you a minute to type a few into the chat, and we'll see what people have to share. Thanks. So we're starting to see some, and I think what I want to flag in some of the things that are coming up are we're seeing people having to span boundaries of geography. So, of moving from a different country, language, context, ways of knowing. And we hear somebody mentioning about kind of like encounters with social constructivism, moving from one disciplinary kind of paradigm to another. And even kind of technological settings. So moving from, for example, in-person instruction to online instruction, all of which are these sort of experiences that can pull us out of our habitual comfort zones, bring us into new contexts for teaching and learning that can have disruptive effects that can both be positive and negative in some ways, or challenging in some ways, and bring about kind of interesting new opportunities for learning. So thanks a lot for some of that, and I note the reference to Vanya's collective gardens, which if I'm not mistaken, you're actually going to see a flash up in a visual on one of the slides here. So both Emily and I had the opportunity to visit that with students, and it was a significant opportunity for learning. Maybe just to move on, we'll begin with just outlining some of the key things that we hope we'll cover in our session today. A couple of the key messages that we'd like you to be able to take home with you. The first is that transformative learning for sustainability requires breaking out of established pedagogical practices, our established disciplinary norms, and oftentimes the types of teaching learning relationships that we're accustomed to engaging in. Phoebe, in her introduction, mentioned the idea of engaging with non-academic actors, community actors, and I think coming to understand what it means to learn alongside communities, for instance, as educators. Secondly, that our academic institutions we challenge, and this based on our experience at McGill, are still poorly equipped to support some of these shifts. As much as we sort of speak to the value of that kind of learning, our ability to accommodate it is still highly uneven and runs into a lot of systemic, individual, and kind of practical barriers. But there's a but here, and I think that we hope to share with you is that through experimentation in transdisciplinary course design, promising pathways to change can emerge. So we're not stuck being in kind of like challenging circumstances. There are ways forward that we'd like to share in terms of some of the experiences that we've had at McGill that hopefully can be a source of ideas and inspiration for action in your own kind of practice contexts. So our structure for today, over the next sort of hour and a half or a little less now, is to share with you, first of all, some of our experiences in transdisciplinary course design. Leave open a space for questions and answers. I think, as mentioned, feel free to enter some questions into the chat as we go, and we'll try and pick those up. But we'll leave a dedicated time for questions and answers. And for those who'd like to stick around and kind of get a little bit more hands-on with this, we'll be creating some time for a bit of interaction and working through some ideas that are inspired from the experiences we'll be sharing today. So we'll leave some time at the end for that, for those of you who would like to engage. Before going further, I'll just share a little bit more about ourselves. Emily and I are both members of the Leadership and Learning for Sustainability Lab at the Department of Integrated Studies and Education, where really one of the things that we are trying to do is understand the sort of what we call like the leverage points for affecting deep changes in our educational systems, our pedagogical practices, our mindsets around teaching and learning to advance more sustainable educational practices and more sustainable kind of ways of organizing our societies, our economies, our educational systems, and so on. So that is the context, and a lot of what we're sharing with you, as you'll see from some of the examples, is inspired by the people some of the people you see on the screen today. There is kind of the co-creation of knowledge and the co-creation of shared meaning is really fundamental to the way that we've been working with many of the people that you see on in this image here in front of you. And I can't see the list of participants at the moment, but if you see yourself on there, thanks for joining, and great to have you with us. So maybe let's just start with sort of some of the fundamentals, which is, why partner with community? And in particular, we're talking about community partnerships, but we understand community broadly. And why do it, and why does transdisciplinary teaching and learning that does kind of advance this kind of partnership beyond the walls of the university or the CEGEP or the school matter when we're trying to teach and learn for sustainability? I think, kind of understood broadly, there's a couple of claims that I think are quite fundamental. The first is that we believe that inter and transdisciplinary collaborations are often a better fit with the complex challenges that we currently face in our society. And second, that in effective partnerships, what often see is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The different knowledges actually lead to a richer understanding of issues that goes beyond what each of us can bring to a question, and that this means more impactful learning, research, and action in confronting some of these challenges. I'm going to return to this first point in a little bit more depth here when we think about kind of complex global challenges like the climate crisis, for instance. These kinds of challenges are often described as wicked, meaning that they have urgent and important kind of contemporary implications. They're often hard to define because there are so many dimensions to them. They have multiple drivers, so it can be very difficult to pinpoint the singular kind of thing that's at the root of them. They're often embedded in deeper trends, deeper issues than we see on the surface, and that solutions are not clear, that they're contested, that there's debate about the best way to solve these, and it's often difficult to prove that one solution is necessarily a better fit than others. addressing these kinds of problems, Stevenson et al. Tell us, it calls for forms of education and governance that create new spaces for collaboration, new spaces for social learning. And that at times these spaces are going to have to be disruptive in order to break away from the unsustainable routines and vested powers and interests that underpin our schools, that underpin our governments, our system, our economies, and so on. So there's a need for responding to these complex challenges to be disruptive, to get us out of many of our comfort zones, and to challenge us to think differently about the issues at hand. We believe that transdisciplinary teaching and learning is one important way that we can do that. And we've undertaken some research at McGill to try and kind of get to the root of some of those claims. We looked at what are the features of teaching and learning that help to build transformative learning around sustainability challenges. And this was in particular in relation to non-formal learning settings, so students working in outdoor learning, in clubs, in out of classroom contexts, and so on. But I think it comes to bear on a whole range of learning settings. So what we discovered through this research is that building our critical understandings of sustainability hinges on three factors. First of all, on bringing learning and action beyond the classroom, seeing how we can bring what we're understanding into real world settings so that we can have agency to affect change. This gets us out of a merely technical understanding of issues and invites us to sort of think about how those translate into real world practices and how those are experienced out in the real world. Secondly, it involves engaging with peers across boundaries. That respondents that we interviewed in looking at this is undergraduate students who were engaged in sustainability learning at McGill report that working with peers that are outside of their discipline, that are outside of the normal community that they're accustomed to learning alongside, that are coming from very different worldviews as them, have deeply transformative effects on the way they understand the challenges and the types of solutions that they can envision to them. We'll return to this when we actually talk about the course experience that we've had. And thirdly, that centering equity and justice, and we don't talk so much about this in our presentation, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that centering equity and justice has a really important effect on learners' experiences of thinking about sustainability challenges, not as a technical challenge, but as like a fundamentally societal and challenge that engages multiple dimensions of the way we live, the way we see the world, and the ways we relate to one another. We have a link to a piece that we could share with you that speaks a little bit more about those. But I think some of these key features are going to be things that we come back to as we talk about our experiences with the courses that we co-designed. So to really get into a little bit more detail around this, we're going to share the experience of a course that we engaged in the co-design and co-instruction of at McGill that maybe provides an illustration of some of these points. I'll hand it over to Emily for that.
Thanks, Blane. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily. And yeah, as Blane mentioned, thinking, bearing all of these sort of key features that we think of as transdisciplinary learning, and I appreciate the questions and thinking about that in the chat. He and I co-taught a course on environmental and sustainability education. This was a few years ago now, but we'd like to use it to sort of illustrate exactly, I think, what the questions in the chat are sort of bringing up. Like, how do we do this? What does it actually look like to say a course is transdisciplinary? And so as we designed the course, we really had sort of three overarching goals in mind. The first being to try to create opportunities for education and environment students to work together. And Blane, if you could, yeah, thanks. And so the second piece is really centering community partnerships and experiential learning through projects. So it was a project-based type course. And this diagram is trying to show we've got environment students and education students. that were working together on projects. And the third thing that we were really trying to do is develop sort of the reflexivity around how this collaborative skills work in order to do that, the sort of process literacy alongside their content knowledge or learning about sustainability or environmental education or climate change. And the partnership piece, in order to do that, so we had a few things that we had to do. First, we had to make our class so the enrollment was open to education students that were studying environment or science majors. Was also open to graduate and undergraduate students. So we sort of had this very big range of students. And those students paired up according to differing backgrounds to work on different projects with our community partners. So we had a range of community partners. And they created actually like a menu of project options that for different sustainability focused organizations. We also had some schools that were looking to do more sort of sustainability type work in their educational context. So we had a little bit of both sides coming from that community perspective also. And I think importantly, the projects that they developed or that they were working on were really proposed initially by the partners, and then students chose to work with projects that spoke to them or they were interested in. And as a result of that, they were really addressing sort of authentic needs that students could then bring their course learnings to. So that was sort of the overall design. To give you sort of a sense of the kinds of projects that they were doing or sort of what we're talking about, these are just screenshots from two of the reports or projects that students did. And so the one on the bottom, a pair of students worked with they called themselves the Eco Committee at Face School. So Face is a K-12 school right next to McGill campus. And it was a group of parents and high school students that were interested in trying to get their school certified as an eco school. And so our students in our course worked with them to propose activities and actually map out a guide for them to use that moving forward. The other project that's on there, Kids for Climate, you'll notice from the date, so we taught this course a few years ago now, it was 2021. So you may remember, and I noticed that some of our things that pushed us out of our comfort zone in the chat was online teaching, and I'm with you on that one. But this was a project where it was actually a group of students in Ottawa that were running an online virtual climate camp for kids, but they didn't have much education background. They just really wanted to be able to do work with young people, but it was quarantine. And so they worked with our students to develop some online activities. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how these project questions came up, and then our students were able to work with each other on those. I've also included here a little bit of sort of the overview of the class, but I'll just read that last sentence from the syllabus, which was, we were trying to help the students, develop knowledge and skills related to environmental and sustainability education through those projects with their partners and then with each other. And this design was really infused from the bottom up with some values that Blane and I share, and we tried to be very explicit about sharing with our students. And they sort of echo some of the features that Blane talked about before. But first, this idea that learning happens everywhere, and also learning for sustainability happens everywhere. It's not just a school-based topic. Similarly, that teaching for sustainability is and we argue really should be done by more than just teachers, right? We have not just education students, but also environment students and lots of different people thinking about how we might do this kind of education or transdisciplinary work. And then third, echoing this idea that sustainability challenges really require this sort of transdisciplinarity, but transdisciplinarity and collaboration are skills and are themselves learned practices. And so Blane and I were trying to do that and model that, and we'll talk a little bit about that also, but that part of the course was actually just learning how. as we did how. And then lastly, that community partnership is really essential to any kind of, these really complex, wicked problems. We're not going to be able to solve them with just working in our schools or in our academic disciplines. And as you can see here, there's for the Vanier folk that are around, and I'll get to this in a minute because we have another picture, but here's one example of us visiting the Vanier Gardens, back whatever they looked like back in 2021. So based on all of this, one of the things that that Blane and I were doing, and so part of my doctoral research was actually to try to understand what kind of learning happens when you're doing this kind of transdisciplinary project or course design. And so I worked with Blane and also the undergraduate who was cited in that previous project worked with us to really work with students after the class was over to talk with and think with what are the kinds of learning processes that they were able to reflect on after or as a result of doing these sort of collaborative projects and having a course that was explicitly transdisciplinary. And we did that through a bunch of different things, interviews, and it was very participatory and focus groups. And the three big things that I'll highlight to sort of share with you that they came up with as they looked back as their own course writings and talking with each other about their writings was the first one of this idea that I think you all have spoken about here in Saltese quite a bit, right? The interdisciplinary learning between the two disciplines of environment and education, but not just exchanging ideas, but actually exchanging roles of what those disciplines might do as far as who is the teacher or who is being sort of the science knowledge provider. And then secondly, really learning to be able to value the different perspectives and not just from having those perspectives spoken, but actually developing some relationships and hearing each other's different positions from their fellow students, but also from our community partners who in some cases were very passionate about the work they were doing, and students were able to draw on that. And lastly, really sort of connecting this idea of transdisciplinary about connecting across boundaries, but doing that through empathy, again, not just for each other, but being connected to community partners that were doing real work on the ground. So to exemplify some of those, I've just pulled a quote from each sort of from each theme. So this first one, Anna was an undergrad working with us and thinking through this idea of sharing knowledge with somebody from education. And she reflected a lot on, she sort of knew the environmental topics already, but how they were being applied in education was really exciting and encouraging to her of like, how does she take this information that she had spent 4 years as an undergrad learning and matched up with the teacher. She also, sticking with Anna for a moment, she also was really interested in how this allowed her to think through different multiple perspectives. And so, and this idea of being able to value, for her, the idea of education that hadn't really been something that she had valued previously. And she says, it instilled this newfound value of the importance of education being accessible to everyone, because it's going to take all kinds of different perspectives and different walks of life to actually make the kinds of changes that she was growing to be much more passionate about doing through education. And then the third sort of theme of this idea of connecting across boundaries and even through sort of emotional connection or empathic connection, one of our education students, Jax, commented that emotions and connections are these actual pedagogical tools that, looking at something like the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis as an event that surpasses barriers between science and society. And so she was able to sort of articulate after the class was over how that shifting was happening. And so just to, that's a very quick snapshot of some of the things the students walked away with. And then to think about some of the things that we walked away with as the lessons that we took away. And many of these lessons are going to be, maybe will resonate for you, even if you don't teach an environmental and sustainability education course. They're not unique necessarily to the sustainability crisis or to transdisciplinary learning, but they, I think, are broadly applicable to other things, and you'll see how Blane and I applied them to some future, some additional work. And so firstly, this idea that time and resources are really important to circumventing all the different institutional barriers that we had. And we had some COVID ones that, again, as noted, we all had to figure those things out. But that Blane and I really tried to be transparent about how we were doing that, and also supporting students in navigating their own. They had their own institutional barriers to figure out could they get to the school? Could we all get to the Vanier Garden together? And how they would work through navigating the partners' goals with their own learning objectives. The second piece was that, students, in reflecting back, they really valued on getting out of their comfort zones, but also, and they acknowledged that, but they also acknowledged that sometimes they needed a bit of a nudge. They commented on things like they wouldn't necessarily have chosen to work with a teacher, for example, or felt confident to go work with a science person, but they really found the authentic experiences meaningful. And they also really found, we did, throughout the course, each student had the opportunity to do sort of a mini presentation from their own expertise, like a 5-minute icebreaker type thing. And those tiny pieces were really those nudges that created a lot of empathy, or allowed students to really see each other's different perspectives. That was a little bit of that nudge that some of them needed. And thirdly, this idea that, we built in reflexivity and iteration into our teaching, which I'm sure is, again, a common theme, but it also has to be part of our own, like, not only the students need to be reflecting and iterating, but that we were doing the same thing as we were teaching. And Blane will share a couple other examples as we continue that process. And then lastly, that having these partnerships and co-design, and Blane and I working together, was really helped. That was sort of the key in order for us to make a lot of those things work, that we were actually modeling our own disciplinary difference. I have a background in classroom teaching, and Blane has more of a background in international climate policy. And so we were very transparent about that and talked through those things. And so that model has also allowed us to expand to other projects. And I'll hand it back to Blane to talk about them.
Thanks, Emily. And maybe I'll just to add on to one point. I think I want to emphasize this because I was the one who was assigned with teaching this class, that we're describing. And I can, as I'm sure many of you who have busy teaching schedules can relate, the idea of fundamentally transforming, redesigning from the bottom up, operating outside of the classroom, operating with partner configurations on my own, undertaking this redesign and doing this kind of in the midst of everything else would have quite literally been impossible. And I think that that's something that's that highlights the barriers to sort of disrupting our practices. It really hinged on the fact that Emily was willing to kind of step up and collaborate with me on this, that we were able to find avenues for that collaboration, that we were able to bring an undergraduate student to work in with us as a summer intern on this, and seeing the sort of the resource ask of kind of rethinking and redesigning and kind of like transforming our pedagogical practices highlights that, like, as desirable as these may be, that it presents significant barriers that we need to be able to sort of engage with. And we need to be able to engage them often kind of in the midst of all the other things that our professional kind of lives and our personal lives kind of throw at us. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is, as we kind of move forward, is, well, what are some of the strategies, or what are some of the resources that we draw on to be able to make this even kind of feasible? How do we, how can we gather the sort of the wherewithal, if you will, to kind of take on the task? And we'd like to share with you just sort of two of the things that we're doing at McGill that I think have kind of focused around the notion of co-creating transdisciplinary sustainability education, have helped us to engage with this task, not only for this course, but actually for a whole range of other courses that we're in the process of redesigning, both within kind of our department, but actually within the university more broadly. And I'm going to only talk about these briefly to highlight some key ideas, but we'd be happy to kind of delve further into them if you've got questions specifically about them. So the first one, and I think you get a little flavor of it through the example that we've just given of the course at the top there, Environmental Sustainability Education, but it's one of 4 courses that over the past few years we've redesigned in this kind of model of iterative co-design, meaning graduate students, community partners, and others working together with a course to kind of reinvent it collectively. And what we've done in all 4 of these examples is actually build on the lessons of the past course redesign. So the one that we've shared with you today, the Environmental and Sustainability Education, was the first, but actually it inspired a lot of the actions that were kind of part of the ED C617 and Education and Sustainability Transformations, and the 2 that follow. And actually what we've seen is that by iterating collaboratively, this is with a number of members of the lab, multiple graduate students, and in the case of the 21st Century Learning course, also teachers and community members, we've been able to sort of draw inspiration from past redesigns to sort of fuel our creative thinking about how we can kind of overcome some of the obstacles for the next ones. Even sort of like returning to past partnerships that have been productive, models of kind of student interaction that have been effective, and just ways of overcoming what may seem kind of to be major structural barriers through the sort of lessons we've learned on how we circumvented them in the past. So by kind of creating this habit of designing courses collectively with a sort of a commitment to iteration, it has been really helpful in expanding this, so that it's not just a one-off effort, but actually a growing set of courses that are designed with these kinds of principles in mind. Now that's what we've been doing within the lab, that the Leadership and Learning for Sustainability lab. At the same time, and we have so I'll just mention that we have a paper that's just in its final stages, where we reflect on kind of what those experiences have been like and how we've benefited from that, but also the kinds of obstacles we've had to overcome. Taking one step back, we've also kind of taken many of those lessons and been inspired by many of those lessons to engage in a similar process across McGill. I don't want to kind of say too much about this because I think there's actually at the Salties conference coming up, Jessica Latta, who I think I spotted on the call, and Stephanie Leite are going to be talking a little bit about this in more detail. But along very similar lines, we've been working McGill-wide to create kind of a community of practice for course redesign and transdisciplinary kind of co-creation through the Sustainability Education Fellows program. And that's a program where faculty members from all different departments of the university receive funding to work with a student to either create a new course design or a redesign of a course so that sustainability is at its center. And in this case, what we're trying to do is really create a kind of a community of practice, as I mentioned, where people are not doing that in isolation, but they're actually exchanging across different disciplinary boundaries, people who are redesigning courses with music, conversing with people who are doing it in engineering, in environmental studies, agriculture, education, and so on, to learn about how we're navigating the different kinds of challenges of doing this work, but also to draw inspiration from one another's work. But again, with this idea of students and instructors or faculty members working collectively on this work. So the idea here has really been about building community while supporting the kinds of transformations in our teaching practices. It's been about connecting the kind of top-down support, so money coming from the university. This has been done with collaboration of our university's teaching and learning services, as well as the Office of Sustainability, with individual kind of bottom-up initiative. So this is, you know, you put yourself forward as an instructor to want to do this, and therefore you've got these are ideas that are coming from faculty members who want to do something differently about sustainability in their teaching. And it's about building the sort of the connections, so you're not doing that out in isolation. and providing some of the key resources that we know are often sticking points to undertaking these deep redesigns, which is, like the knowledge of how to rethink this, the time needed to be able to do it, and some of the even financial resources to be able to sort of support that redesign. And so bringing those together, we are now in the 3rd year of that process and have redesigned, I believe, 22 or so courses across the university using this model. So both of these examples, I think, are kind of pointing at the same thing of the way that co-creation, partnership can be kind of catalytic to imagining, designing, and undertaking the kind of transdisciplinary course design around sustainability. Maybe just to close, I think when we look at those 2 examples, what do we see as some of the kind of keys to success? And I think we highlight these, thinking about if you're thinking about how could this work? How could some of these ideas work at your own institutions? These are some of the things that we feel like made them possible. We mentioned the need to sort of identify and refine shared values. It's about creating spaces where we can kind of collectively make sense, find points of connection, and build on those. In the case of the lab and those 4 courses, the fact that we've kind of over the years of iterating on different courses, we've kind of developed a shared repertoire and a shared understanding of our visions. It has allowed us to sort of work much more effectively together. Oftentimes in universities, and I would imagine the same is true in CEGEPs, is like there's not time or spaces to like build those sense of connection and that sense of connectedness, and that can be a major barrier to like doing the visioning together. Next is to sort of disrupt some of the hierarchies of expertise. At a university like McGill, there is this sort of like strong tradition of like a very, if you will, narrow vision of what expertise looks like. And I think being able to step out of that, to set that aside, to look at the sort of the knowledge, the experience, the expertise that is embedded in community, that's embedded in kind of real world practice, and to want to sort of center that is really important for transdisciplinary course design to be kind of meaningful, so that it's not just a kind of garnish on the plate of what is otherwise like highly technical, scientific knowledge. It is resource intensive doing this kind of work, and we need resources not only in terms of the time, I mentioned the space, as well as, for example, the financial resources to be able to recruit support, hiring or paying for the efforts that community partners, that graduate students and others bring to helping make this happen. And lastly, and I think it's quite important, is we often then run into the mismatch between this kind of learning, this kind of experiential, community-facing learning, with sometimes quite a bit narrower expectations around evidence of learning, how we evidence that learning, the kinds of assessments that we expect to have, the kinds of standardization that we have in terms of assessments. And when those mismatches are kind of made evident, it can sometimes lead us to kind of not being able to go as deep and be as transformative as I think we would have liked to. So I think with that, we'll pause and we'll see if there are questions and kind of points of discussion. I think we'll hand it back to Phoebe to see if you want to kind of pick up on anything. I'm happy to. I haven't been able to track kind of questions or chat in the chat box, but we can take a few minutes for those before we perhaps see if there's time for a bit of interaction after that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you both, Emily and Blane. That was really interesting. I was taking notes for my own use, not for this. There haven't been questions in the chat. There's been a lot of discussion and comments and things like, I really like this. Like Liam here says, you can see at the bottom that he really loves the student-teacher course design collaboration, and it reminds you, Liam, of Dawson's New School. I do know we've talked about that before in some of these Saltese webinars, the student teachers working together to design a course and the pros and cons and the resources required to make that work. but I don't see any questions here specifically. So I think we can open it up now if you've been hoarding your questions, waiting for this time. Oh, here's one from Lisa. There we go. Keep them coming in the chat, or please feel free to raise your hand and you can speak out loud. We'll start with Lisa, and then Faye, I see your hand for next. So Lisa says, would love to know more about different ways of assessing that you've used.
Do you want to start, Emily, or shall I? So I think one of the things that I can mention, and this comes up to you know, I think within those of us who study within the School of the Faculty of Education, and particularly within our department, are used to sort of having quite flexible and adaptive modes of assessment that privilege kind of experiential learning, student reflection, looking at kind of you know, recognizing the sort of cognitive, psychomotor, and affective kind of dimensions of learning, the head, the heart, and the hands of learning, and trying to build assessment that kind of connects with all three of those. What we've seen from the sustainability education fellows is that in other fields, that may be like a lot more new. You know, just, I mean, I always call out engineering, not because I have any problem with engineering, but I find our engineer fellows are often kind of like quite upfront about feeling challenged or unsure about how to proceed with things that are assessments of more than the sort of the content knowledge. And in particularly, how do you assess kind of the effective domains of learning? We, in the course that we've taught and some of the others, we've relied heavily on student reflections, student journaling, peer-to-peer kind of interaction as part. So kind of almost dialogical assessment that is engaged between kind of members of the partnership. We asked, for instance, in one of the big questions that came up in designing these partnerships from community partners was community partners saying, I don't want to be responsible for like assessing these students. I don't feel comfortable with that. And so we've been quite clear of saying this is not the responsibility of community partners, but that we value community partner reflections on what the experience has been like. And so trying to kind of look at assessment more holistically, not just about kind of who assigns the number or the score next to an assignment, but who provides a reflection and a feedback on what this experience has been like. So at the end of the course, for instance, we held an open presentation and celebration of all the projects that had been done. And in almost all the cases, the partner organizations joined, even though I think it was, you know, just, there was no requirement of it, but in almost all cases, they joined and fed back on what they observed and learned and experienced from that process. And so sort of thinking a bit more holistically about assessment being not just sort of the measuring of learning, but the feeding back of like, what are we getting out of some of these experiences? What is, how has this kind of moved forward my thinking, and what am I potentially taking away from this experience into my future practice? So we've used journaling, audio, multiple kind of media for reflecting, using sort of portfolios, so scaffolded kind of experiences of writing first a proposal of what the project might look like, then interim reflections on how the project is developing, then this kind of more formal submission, and then a kind of more holistic reflection on like, what did I take away from this? How did this kind of shape my work? Those are some of the things that we've been kind of playing with. Emily, I'll let you kind of see if there's anything else you want to add on to that.
No, I'll maybe just comment that I appreciate the question, Lisa, and the reason I deferred quickly to Blane is that I'm going to be teaching a new version of this class just for undergrads in about 3 weeks, and I am definitely still trying to figure out how I'm going to do assessment with a larger group. It's a much larger class, and so you know, we'll still be building in sort of some very open-ended rubrics about what the projects need to contain, but being sensitive. I mean, the tension, and I think you're probably getting at, is that because the partners are saying what the project should be, I need to have some flexibility in how we're able to assess did the students sort of meet the need of the partner? And then do they also show that they've learned some of the content about educational theory or, those pieces? So I guess I'm just chiming in to say it is definitely a work in progress as the project scales up and down, and depending on who the TA is and how I do that. So I'll be happy to share some of that. Maybe give me a couple of weeks and I might have a better idea. But yeah, I mean, still some reflections, but when you have 45 of them, right, it's different than reading 20. So.
So thank you. There was a question next or comment from Faye. Faye, you want to unmute?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm personally really interested in the metacognitive aspects because my own research has to do with that, and also like dialogic learning in general regarding environmental issues. So what I've noticed is that a lot of times students in environmental studies or who are already into it tend to have a lot of difficulty sort of taking on perspectives of those who challenge their views. And I'm wondering if the experiential component to the learning process has helped any students sort of gain a better understanding of those with different perspectives in their own, be a little bit more open-minded, and sort of overcome biases that they already have about like other students.
Yeah, that's a great question, Faye. As you're asking, I was thinking in particular, and Blane, maybe you also, we had one student that was in the agriculture, and her, I'm thinking particularly about her understanding of shifting, not so much about sort of being more empathic to other people's views, but thinking about taking a look at things like critical pedagogy and how schools have even sort of built up, knowledge from this transmissive way. And so even for somebody that had gone all the way through a sort of agricultural science trajectory. So she had a lot of reflection of just how do we start talking about the basic assumptions of what education is, and then what are these ideas that I need to be able to, like, how did I get to these ideas about food justice? So she was developing a lesson plan on food justice. And so she really reflected a lot on realizing that she just wasn't going to create a bunch of slides on avocados, that she was going to, really need to back it up and think about how it is that she came to that knowledge and how she would share. And she was an international student, so thinking through how she was going to shift all of those. So in that way, less so about what you directly asked, but I think in a different metacognitive way, and maybe even a more, fundamental shift in how she was thinking about what education does. Blane, I don't know if you want to add.
No, I mean, I take your point. And in that case, I think if we're thinking of the same person, this was actually a doctoral student who was taking the course, so who had really kind of been a product of an educational system for a great many years, to sort of come into a learning context that invited them to think critically about something, like the waters they'd been swimming in for that many years. In terms of the sort of the question of does the community partnership do that? I think it does. I mean, we sometimes talk about in knowledge co-production and knowledge co-creation the power of in the theories around this, like the value and the power of what we sometimes call like a boundary object, right? So the boundary object can be like something that we co-produce together, or something that we do together, that kind of takes it away from a kind of a direct kind of one facing one dialogical relationship, which kind of can sometimes bring our differences of perspective into like really strong contrast, and then rather invite us to kind of think together about how we're interpreting the challenge or the thing that we're working on together. And so we saw that often because we required the partnership of an education and a non-education major on something. The conversations about kind of interpreting the task provided the space for, I think, surfacing why we're understanding the task very differently because of the sort of priors, if you will, like all of the sort of like the assumptions and the ways of kind of interpreting a challenge or something, you know, those all came to the surface. And I think that in particular, where this came in is when they engaged with community organizations that themselves were deeply values centered. So, you know, these projects were not kind of value neutral, just sort of tasks to get done, but actually like very value laden food justice, environmental justice, you know, these kinds of issues. And so they too were kind of pushing students to step out of, I think, from both directions, their comfort zones. So you ended up with, I think, in some cases, quite quite challenging experiences for learners to digest and respond to these things. That, as I think some of the quotes that Emily shared there, like I think had that disruptive effect that I mentioned in that initial quote from Stevenson, that sometimes that like it's through those encounters that we disrupt some of our understandings and open up spaces for thinking differently about the challenge. And I think the evidence, I mean, one of the things that we often get asked for in this is like, well, what kind of evidence do you have that any of that actually kind of was meaningful? And some of them came out of there saying like, I actually want to choose a different career path. I want to do things like, you know, I want to shift my trajectory fundamentally. So we see, I think, the power that those things can have as people's eyes are open to kind of like what lies beyond what they've been kind of disciplined into as their sort of primary trajectory. And so that's, I think, quite inspiring to see from some of the students. Hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So Blane and Emily, there haven't been more questions in the chat, but please, anyone, feel free to type or raise your hand. But at the same time, oh, Maria, did you just
Yes.
put your hand up?
Yeah,
Go
I just put
ahead.
my hand up. Yeah. Hi, Blane. Hi, Emily. So this is Maria from Teaching and Learning Services at McGill. A question I have is, how did you manage to, I don't recall if you said the redesign was happening while the course was being taught or not, but either way, how do you manage not to overlap with tasks that sometimes a TA may be assigned to do, or a research assistant? Because I think there some roles, yeah, can overlap, and I know at least at McGill we can get in trouble when we are taking some tasks from TAs or so.
You mean in the design process?
Both.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we kind of we've argued is that actually the course design process, if we think of, we talk about in the paper that we're working on, we talk about like co-design, co-teaching, and co-learning as like these three different spaces where we can kind of like engage in the collaborative sense making. And that co-designing in many ways, even when you look at the literature and when you think about our university processes, it's one of the ones that gets perhaps less airtime. That we have a lot of policies around co-teaching. We have, you know, like a lot of governance around it. I think there remains, at least at McGill, a kind of view, and that's not to diminish what Teaching and Learning Services does, which is offer like workshops for you know, faculty members to go and kind of think, but it remains oftentimes a really kind of isolated process of you working on your own kind of in the months leading up to teaching a new course at your desk, kind of like building up a new syllabus and so on and so forth. And so in kind of that space, it wasn't so much that we were kind of running into policies that that were kind of counter to it. It was actually just sort of a vacuum of kind of opportunities. At other universities, and we've seen other universities where these kind of opportunities for working with students to co-design. Carleton was one of the ones that inspired us. They have a whole program on, or a whole kind of opportunity stream on this. And now the Sustainability Education Fellows at McGill is a sort of one that does that. But in many instances, there just was like very little in kind of pre-existing spaces that kind of afforded the opportunity to work collaboratively to design courses. So it was more about kind of like making those spaces and making the conditions for it. One of the things that our department has is a it's sort of a version of a reading course that is called like the Art and Practice of Teaching, if I'm not mistaken on the course title, which is a course that graduate students can register for so that they get credit for working with instructors on designing and teaching a course. And so this was when we were doing our mapping of what were like some of the key enablers and barriers, we flagged that both Emily and one of the other designers, that Stephanie, who worked on another course, actually kind of registered for this so that they got credit for doing that work. Nonetheless, we still had to do kind of a number of workarounds to kind of make this feasible. And in some cases, think very creatively on how to sort of work around the system. And we talk about that in terms of this is where we run into some of the systemic barriers that I think are quite important to identify, to sort of like these barriers to doing this as a sort of a matter of practice. Things like being assigned courses kind of very much at the last minute because of the just-in-time model of kind of educational planning that so many of our institutions are involved in, that don't kind of create the space for doing this kind of careful, collaborative, dialogical kind of design process. Once it came time to teach it, we were able to sort of, I think, draw on some of the, things like RA-ships and TA-ships and things like that, that were appropriate. But again, it's recognizing maybe to some extent that different departments have different levels of flexibility, and we were able to sort of make the most of some of the flexibilities that that were available to us in our department. But yeah, it's a big question. I think it's a big question for higher education in general, and one that we've been asking is like, how do we kind of emphasize the value and the merits of taking that time to prepare courses in ways that are kind of open-ended, that are collective, that are dialogical, and in many cases that's just not happened. And the literature, actually, as we reviewed the literature for the paper that we read, is pretty sparse on it, in fact. So it's not just that McGill's got a gap there. I think there's like a wider gap, but would value others' kind of reflections on it or sharing of experiences that others have been engaged in on this.
And you mean which portion, the co-design, or the entirety, or interdisciplinarity?
I mean, both partnering, sort of like, I think one of the things is that the sort of partnering with community and doing the transdisciplinary requires a bunch of upfront work. The number of hours required to establish, set up the expectations, kind of inventory the partners. The fact that we, as I mentioned earlier, we were only able to do that because actually we had somebody working kind of, I don't remember how many hours a week, the whole semester prior, kind of doing outreach, creating a brochure of possible community partners and all of these things. And I think we're just wanting to be transparent about the sort of the upfront work that's needed to make this kind of impactful, and to call for, in some ways, the sort of attention to that in kind of how our institutions support innovative teaching practice. So, if others are kind of engaged in this, I saw somebody mentioning Kurt Hallfield at Dawson has been doing something with, with some of the students there. But, if there are good practices beyond ours, I think that would be they're great to learn about.
It's 3:37, so I don't see more questions. I don't see more hands, although please do speak up if you want to. Do you guys want to move to your interactive part at this point? We've got, about 20 minutes left in total.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to set it up. And so actually I'll reshare. So we have an interactive part. We're conscious that sometimes people who are kind of interested in passively kind of participating are less interested in kind of moving into active participation. And so we put this at the end to not disrupt the flow of things. But for those who'd like to kind of discuss in a more kind of intimate kind of way some of this, we've created a brief interactive segment. What we'd like to invite you to do is to just reflect for a moment on your own teaching practice, your own institutional practices, and thinking about kind of what is a course or a learning opportunity where you imagine that this kind of community partnered transdisciplinary approach would be the most relevant or important in your own teaching practice, and to give it just a moment's thought. And what we're going to do is we'll break out into smaller groups. We have a little template for you to work on, and we'll be in groups of 3 to 4 to either just share your own reflections on the sort of the idea that you've got, or potentially to work with one of the ones that you find like, especially interesting or inspirational that somebody in your breakout group is sharing. We'd like you to think about, like, what would that look like, and what kinds of barriers and kind of practices would you imagine being able to kind of adopt to make that feasible. I hope the invitation is clear. We've created a little template for you to sort of record some ideas, and so I'll just sorry, go ahead.
Say, so the template is in the chat, right?
Yeah,
It
I
should be.
posted a Google Doc. Sorry, I didn't say what it was. I just pasted and then hit enter.
Yeah, so Emily has just posted a link. I'll just double check that I've set the sharing settings right, because I'm notoriously bad at remembering to make it editable by all. Hopefully it does that. And what we'll do is create some breakout rooms, give you maybe like 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to discuss.
So I just created the breakout rooms. Can I open them like officially?
Yeah, go ahead.
They're open.
And
I think people can join. I think they're joining away. Huh?
Yeah.
Great. I'd enjoy.
But we could launch, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I'm been assigned one, Blane, so I'll just go to that one, and mine's number 1, and I'll move sequentially.
Yep.
And it's great.
All right, can go. Do you see your breakout room, Blane?
I do. I was just waiting to like double check whether things were working on this end, but you're gonna make sure. Like, I see Caroline's here. I wanted to just kind of double check. I can move over to my breakout room now. Oh, I've lost it now. There it is. A couple of minutes left. Oops, there we go. So thank you for that. I don't know if anyone wanted to share any kind of like closing reflection for things that stood out or observations from their small group dialogue.
I will
Emily.
just to say that I popped into 2 different groups, and every single group had multiple ideas of sort of, here's how we might start doing this and sort of where could it go next, right? Like lots of different ways that science folks, we were just talking about science communication branching out, but then Lorraine, you were just sharing, and then we cut off more of a technological intervention for blinking different, like an app that connects folks. So yeah, it was really divergent and really helpful for me to think. And then one of the ones happens to be a connection that will hopefully reappear in the next version of the course that I'll be teaching. So that was fun.
Thanks. I don't know, Phoebe, do we want to hand over to you for any closing kind of words on this?
You're muted, Phoebe.
Hi. Oh, it must have brought me back muted.
Mhm.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Blane. Thank you, Emily. That was really great. It's very interesting. And the breakout room that I was in, breakout room 3 with Carolyn and Kurt, was again really interesting. So I think that was a great idea, and we appreciate it, having that time to talk. I think probably people can check out the slides too to see what other people came up with. There's probably some interesting stuff in there. So yeah, so on behalf of Saltese and everyone here, we would like to thank you very much for taking the time to share your experiences with us.
Thank you.